Good. Just want to make sure with the technology, better to ask. So thank you, Alicia and Ed, for organizing the conference. I know it's a lot of work, and Ed, Ed mentioned yesterday that we were lucky to get 4 or 5 people at AEA meetings, and now I think he mentioned we're up to about 45 or so. So Ed, great job, and Alicia, great job for putting all this together and getting us all together for what I think is an important topic. So thank you very much. In terms of this paper, this is co-authored with Ming Xiao, who was a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, now is at Queen's University. And what we're focusing our work on is occupational licensing and labor market fluidity. So where a lot of current work in economics is on issues of equity and income inequality, this work is on labor market efficiency and how efficient labor markets might work, and what effect occupational licensing has on the ability to, is licensing grease or sand in the mobility in the labor market. So that's sort of the focus of this particular paper, and we try to provide some theory and evidence on the issue of fluidity and how efficient labor markets might be in the face of occupational licensing. So it's obvious occupational licensing has grown over the past few decades, certainly from around 5% to somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 workers in the U.S. workforce have attained an occupational license. There's also been, and one thing we noticed, is a decline in labor market dynamism. And what I mean by that is the following. So licensing growth and occupational switching rates. So this line is the decline in people switching between occupations from the mid-1990s to early 2015. Certainly it's been affected by the business cycle. In contrast, occupational licensing has been growing. So I'm sure you could put a lot of different declining factors, unions, many other factors that have been declining over time, and certainly occupational licensing has been growing. So this is just one additional factor, that the ability or the fact that individuals are switching jobs a lot less in the U.S. labor market is at least correlated with the fact that occupational licensing has been growing. So that's one issue. And the research question that we're trying to examine is, what are the effects of occupational licensing on labor market dynamics? So what's been happening over time, and in terms of switchers or people moving into or out of an occupational license, and also what are the welfare implications of increasing licensing requirements for workers? So does this reduce the ability of the labor market on a cost benefit? Does it result in a net cost, or does the fact that licensing may contribute to declining dynamics result in an increased cost as a result of occupational licensing? So one of the issues is, what we do is to examine the relationship between licensing, occupational switching, and wage changes that are associated. So we're looking at the dynamics, people who are going into and out of a licensed occupation, and what are the wage effects of people who go into and out of a licensed occupation by different characteristics. That is, do they move from being employed to being employed? Do they move from non-employment to employment, and vice versa? So we look at a lot of different types of switches between occupations based on the characteristics of the occupation, including occupational licensing. So the main results, in case you need to leave the session early, and I always like to give you the punchline up front, is that there's for licensing, licensed workers are about 10% less likely to switch occupations of people who are employed, and about 0.5% less likely to become non-employed. And non-employed doesn't mean unemployment, unlike the first paper, but are they moving from being employed, either dropping out of the workforce or becoming unemployed. And also conditional on switching in, workers are 10% less likely to have switched into a licensed occupation if they were working, and about 0.5% less likely if they were not employed. And the main results are that as a result of these higher premiums, wage growth is higher for licensed workers, whether they stay in the occupation, about 6.3 percentage points, or about $2,200 on average. So these are individuals who are licensed who stay in the occupation. Individuals who switch out of a licensed occupation, they're moving, for example, from being an accountant to a coder, they gain as well, and the wage gain is about $1,200. People who switch into a licensed occupation from another job gain more. They gain about $1,800, and there's higher entry from people who are unemployed in terms of higher entry into individuals who are unemployed. Their wage gains are about 11.4 percentage points higher. Also, what we find is that when you put licensing into sort of a macro effect, that licensing can account for about 8% of the total decline in this occupational mobility. So I was able to show the decline in the transitions in terms of different jobs, and if you put licensing into that in terms of the total decline based on our parameters, in sort of a structural model, that licensing can account for almost 8% of the decline. And the results above hold whether the switching rates are within groups, vary only in terms of licensing shares across time, and increased licensing results in a decline in mobility between almost 2% to 1.5%. And this decline in fluidity represents an additional channel for welfare effects. So the idea that licensing may contribute to the decline in overall welfare, which some earlier work I did with Evan Soltis tries to get at what are the overall or macroeconomic effects of licensing in terms of a cost-benefit framework, in terms of what individuals are willing to pay for having a licensed service, and in terms of the overall macro effects. So what are the background for this? Licensing effects is licensing on static labor markets. Some of the work I've done with Alan Kruger, Evgeny Vorotnikov, and others have looked at sort of the overall effects of licensing in terms of looking at cross-sectional results. There have also been some dynamic licensing effects, that is looking at licensing and its effects on wages over time. Also work on what effect licensing has on interstate mobility, the ability of individuals to move across states, and barriers to entry as a result of reciprocity problems or issues within a particular occupation. And we also tie this work to overall declining labor market dynamism in terms of Davis and Haltwanger, and work that my co-author has done, looking at what effects, why is the labor market decline in terms of ability to switch between occupations. So the roadmap for the paper is I impose a theory tax. I know most of you are empiricists, but I'll go through a bit of a theory of why this institution may result in potentially lower costs, and sort of suggest that the model is ambiguous. Go through our data, some empirical evidence, some baseline specifications, a number of robustness tests, and we go through some conclusions and implications for potential policies. So in terms of the theory, we start out with a discrete choice model. Workers choose sequential occupations in terms of maximizing discounted lifetime utility. Workers receive preference shocks every period, so they decide in every period should they stay or should they leave. They pay costs as a result of switching occupations. This is the model is more detailed in the paper. I guess that's available to you on your flash drive that you received for the conference. And also we specify the model in terms of the costs. The costs to licensing are entry costs, that is costs in terms of paying an entry fee. There are also training costs. So when you take into account the cost of entry, paying fees, taking tests, and as well look at the costs that it takes in terms of training to enter a new occupation. These other costs are normalized to zero. And what we find is the probability of moving from a non-licensed to a licensed occupation, taking into account licensing costs are less than zero, so you'd expect it to be lower. When you take into account the issues of training costs, also that would also result in a reduction in licensing. So the key takeaways from our model is that entry costs are likely to go up, then licensing or entry or the ability to move into a licensed occupation goes down. Training time as a result of moving to a licensed occupation, especially occupation-specific training, is likely to go up. The probability of becoming unemployed, on the other hand, is likely to go down because there are barriers to entering the occupation. As a result, that's a positive in terms of entering an occupation. Training time goes up, and all these are sort of ambiguous in terms of would you find an increase or decrease in entering a licensed occupation, especially over the life cycle. So are you likely to see different transitions moving into an occupation that's licensed early in your career relative to later in your career, given that there are entry costs to licensing and there are additional training costs to licensing? So the theory is ambiguous, so we then go on to the data. So just as a basic licensing 101, perhaps in this group not necessary, is licensing. It requires an individual who wants to perform a certain type of occupational license to obtain permission from the government in order to do so. We use the CPS data, and in terms of our estimates, we use the 3 questions in the CPS. Are you licensed? Do you actively have a license or certificate? Was it issued by a government agency? And is it required for your job? We also do some sensitivity analysis looking at only questions 1 and 2 in the CPS. Our major data sources are starting in 2016 through 2018. We use the CPS and the CPS definition of licensing. We also do some robustness tests on the survey of income and program participation. We use the 2008 wave, so we are able to get some of the dynamics, which we looked at in an earlier paper with Maury Gittleman and Mark Glee, to look at some of the transitions and changes of individuals who are licensed. And we look at other SIP panels from 1990 to 2008. In terms of whether an occupation is licensed and the criteria, there's a data set that will be available this summer, at least in terms of initial entry data, is the Occupational Licensing Law Research Project at the Minnesota Population Center. Those of you who use CPS or census data, it will be available through that same source. And we also use some ONET data in terms of looking at what are the requirements for being in a licensed occupation. So the CPS, and this is an issue that this is since I have a few minutes, extra want to go through what I call data cleaning, and this is for the good of the cause. This is for if you're using the CPS, and a lot of folks are now using the CPS for measurements of licensing. We did some experiments in terms of the data cleaning in the CPS. The licensing questions in the CPS are asked in month 1 and month 5, but wages are only asked in month 4 and month 8. Consequently, there's some differences in the percent licensed and wage data in terms of both when the questions on licensing are asked and when the data in terms of wages are asked. So licensing status changes over those months in the CPS, and we notice the following. So for when individuals are first interviewed, this was month 1 and month 2, the licensing status changes were about 0.52, but they declined when those questions were not asked. We also noticed the second time interviews in terms of licensing status changes in the percent declined precipitously when those questions were not asked. So we were concerned about this dramatic decline on a month-to-month basis of data in the CPS. So what we did was to impute licensing status. So we looked at month 1 and month 4, and we checked for whether those individuals also changed their occupation, industry, and employment status and their class of work. So when none of those changed, there was a change from non-licensed to licensed. We assumed that there was no change over those months. And the same if there was non-licensed to licensed in month 4. So we looked at other characteristics to try to impute those licensing characteristics, whether those individuals were licensed in the months where those questions were not asked. So given that that's the case, what we did was to impute these licensing, whether individuals were licensed in months 2, 3, month 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4. And when we imputed the numbers, they seem much more consistent with month 1. For the second time interviewees, we did the same thing. And when we imputed the results, we found the results were much more consistent. We looked at other characteristics rather than just the licensing data, which the CPS presents. So that's one thing to be aware of if you're looking at some of the dynamics within the CPS, is that we think there's some errors in the data in the months that they don't ask about changes in licensing status. So we did both our imputed values for months 4 and 8, and we also did the months that the CPS data as robustness checks. But this is something we thought was of interest to those of you who are using the CPS to analyze occupational licensing. And we don't know why these results tend to differ, but we certainly thought that this was an issue within the data and the wide use of the CPS, that this is something that researchers in this area ought to be aware of. So that's for the good of the cause. So moving on to our issue, which is sort of empirical evidence and the growth of licensing, is first of all, licensing has grown substantially. The share of workers who are licensing has increased, and the share of of occupations that require a license. So, for example, if you look at, this is sort of data from initial licensure for a wide variety of occupations, and the dots represent when those occupations were initially licensed, from occupational therapists to lawyers and doctors. The newbies starting are sort of occupations that didn't fully become licensed to the 1950s, include OT, PT, physical therapists, cosmetologists, and barbers. A number of other occupations like teachers were licensed well before the 1950s. Also, occupational licensing requirements have become more costly. So not only at the extensive margin, you see the sort of the growth of licensing, but also the intensive margin. So for example, here's transition and education requirements for physical therapists. So in the 1990s, most physical therapists had a bachelor's degree, and that declined dramatically. And then starting in about 2004, physical therapists, and now virtually all states require physical therapists to be doctors of physical therapy. So there's been a rather dramatic change in both the extensive and intensive margins for occupational licensing. So there's been growth in the number of occupations that are licensed, and in terms of the requirements it takes to get into the occupation. So given these changes, there's also been the requirements covers education, licensing costs, renewal time, exams, hours of training, costs of renewal. All these are costs of licensing, which really fit into our model. So there's both job-specific training and also training in terms of entering the occupation. And here's some examples. So for example, education requirements for land surveyors in 1995 was basically a bachelor's degree. This is measured in terms of 2 being high school, 4 being associate degree, 6 bachelor, and 8 postgraduate. So in virtually all these occupations, except for veterinarians, the education requirements have increased, and in some cases very significantly in terms of general training. Also, the initial cost, what it costs to get a license, the initial cost of a license has increased by about 116% from 1995 to 2013. This is much more rapid than the cost of inflation, and the renewal costs have also grown by a similar amount for most of these occupations. And this might be a source, although I haven't done this, but this might be a source of revenue for states, so that rather than raising taxes for everyone, the initial and renewal costs can go up for licensing. This might be a source of revenue, especially when 1/5 of the workers have to pay to enter those occupations. So, so that's sort of the model. That gives you sort of the background, the fact that both the number of occupations that are licensed have grown, the cost of entering an occupation have grown, so that this is sort of, one would expect that this might also have an effect on the ability of people to move into or leave licensed occupations. So this is sort of the basic data. So these are the switching rates. So this is J to J, that is people who are moving, and I'm going to give you lots of different mobilities. So these are people who are moving from job to job and people who moved into a licensed occupation. So these are the rates in the CPS. So the individuals who are switching who are not licensed, and this is with no controls. These are just the basic data. So people are switching job to job, switching into non-licensed occupations, are about twice as high as individuals who are switching into licensed occupations. looking at individuals job to job, people who are leaving licensed occupations, those individuals who are not licensed tend to leave to a much higher degree than individuals who are licensed. So just the basic data suggests there's a lot of movement into and out of licensed, non-licensed occupations to a much greater degree. This is individuals, and this is sort of complementary to the work in the first paper, is people who are switching from switching rate from non-employment. That is, and non-employment is either individuals who are not employed or out of the labor force, and individuals who are switching into non-licensed occupations are much higher than licensed occupations, but the rates are not as high as people who are switching from job to job. Our rationale for that is that people who have a job, the opportunity cost for them to spend the money and time and general and specific training to switch into an occupation is much higher relative to people who are not employed. So we would expect the job to job switching rate to be lower for licensed occupations than for individuals who are not employed. Similarly, people who switch job in terms of job to non-employment, licensed individuals tend to stay in the job a lot longer relative to individuals who are not licensed. So that you would expect too, that individuals in those jobs who are licensed have an investment. There could be behavioral economics. There could be investments that they take part of. It could be individuals who are fenced out. The opportunities are much greater, but they certainly don't move to non-employment. So here's sort of a view of the trend line. And again, in the CPS, you're able to get percent licensed, the licensing share of those individuals. For individuals who are not licensed, occupational mobility rates tend to be much higher, and occupations like accountants are universally licensed, that is, they're licensed in all states, but most accountants don't attain an occupational license, which the CPS allows you to look at. Preschool and kindergarten teachers, barbers, and registered nurses. Virtually all registered nurses attain an occupational license. Obviously, they're also covered by occupational license. So the trend line seems to suggest that the more that you're required to have a license, or those people who attain a license, the less likely you are to move across occupations. And this is people who switch out. And then the same thing is true in terms of people who switch in. That is, the more heavily licensed you are in terms of attaining a license, the less likely you are to be a switcher into a licensed occupation. Again, sort of basic measures. So these are sort of our basic results. In terms of looking at the empirical models, so these are sort of the views of individuals who are switching, taking into account some covariates. So we use some measures of individual licensing indicators, individual characteristics, and we also use occupation and state fixed effects. Our X's include the traditional covariates in the CPS. So we have occupation and state fixed effects, year and month fixed effects, and trying to see when you control for individual and state and occupation fixed effects, do our basic results hold? And also looking at individuals who switch in and out of, that we look at individuals who are switching status between time periods T and T+1. So the switching out, individuals who leave licensed occupations, and individuals who come into licensed occupations. Are they influenced? And our key variable is whether you are licensed at time period I, are you likely to switch in time period T-1 to time period T? And then our control group is using some propensity matching measures. We use some propensity score matches over observable characteristics, and we use a couple of different measures of matching to come up with our control group in the CPS. So what are our results? And these are the percent effect of licensing on annual transitions. These are the coefficients. In the first column are predicted values, and the percent effect is the probability of switching out of a licensed occupation is about almost 24% less when you're in an occupation. So we call this, in terms of moving out, is our sort of Hotel California effect. So once you enter an occupation, those of you who know old style rock music, that's sort of one of the Eagles stories of Hotel California. Once you come to a licensed occupation, you rarely leave. And also the same sort of effects tend to be the case in terms of job-to-job transitions. Switching into a licensed occupation is also more difficult. Switching non-licensed, that is job to non-licensed, the effects are negative. Switching from non-licensed to a job to a licensed job, the effects are also small. And then we look at the difference between switching from a job versus a non-job, and the effects are sort of the average of those two. So the overall effect is certainly negative, and depending on whether you're moving from job to job, the effects are much larger relative to moving from a job to non-employment, or moving to a licensed occupation from non-employment. So, and again, our hypothesis is, again, that individuals who have a job, the opportunity costs of their getting the additional training and paying the additional costs are much higher than those people in non-employment. But that certainly is the case in our data. Looking at monthly transitions, which are much larger, there's a lot more noise in that data relative to the annual transitions, but we are able to provide those estimates, and those results tend to be much bigger. The magnitudes are much bigger, but the effects tend to be of a similar nature. That is, individuals who are moving out of a licensed occupation are much smaller. Individuals moving in tend to be much smaller in terms of moving into a licensed occupation. We similarly find people who are moving from a job to a non-licensed occupation tend to be negative, and people who are not employed moving to a job also tend to be less likely to go to a licensed occupation. The difference between those two is provided as well. So what are the effects, given that people are moving less? Is there any effect of licensing on labor market dynamics in terms of wages? And what we look at is provide some basic mean values. And this is a bit we were a bit surprised to find the results in terms of wage growth for stayers. So individuals who are non-licensed, their wage growth tends to be somewhat larger. And this is with no controls. And what we found looking at the data is that non-licensed individuals tend to be younger, and their wage changes tend to be much larger. Now, when we put in our controls, those results flip. But in terms of the basic numbers, given that we have no covariates with these, we find the stayers' wage growth is higher for licensed occupations. When you look at wage growth for switchers, the licensed occupations are much higher. So those people who switch from non-licensed to licensed, those wage growth numbers tend to be much higher. And although we did use some in an earlier paper I did with Maury Gittleman, where we looked at switchers in the NLSY, we found results very similar to this. Unfortunately, with the NLSY, we weren't able to have licensing attainment. It was only moving into an occupation that's covered by a license. This data, I think, is better because you look at whether someone actually attained an occupational license. So we find those people who switch gain who are in license. This is sort of the monthly or weekly wages by age. And what we find, and not surprisingly, is results very similar to earlier results, is that licensing, early on, the wage gains tend to be much smaller, but they tend to become much larger over time. So the gains, the duration effects of licensing tend to widen, in the area under the curve of licensed relative to non-licensed tends to be much bigger as individuals age and go through their work life cycle. And those are similar results that I found with some work with Evan Solstice in terms of earlier versus later gains to occupational licensing. So those results tend to be fairly consistent. What we find in terms of our empirical specification, and we basically use very much the same type of model, that is the switching out effect. That is what happens to individuals in terms of their wage growth in period T to T+1, controlling for occupation, controlling for licensing, and individual characteristics. We use the same type of model, that is wage changes between T-1 and T in terms of individuals who switch in to a licensed occupation. So what are the effects of licensing on individuals in terms of transitions? And what we find is generally consistent results, but the wage growth for people who stay in a licensed occupation is about over the course of a year, is the wage changes are about $2,200. The wage growth for switchers, those people who are in a licensed occupation but go to a non-licensed occupation, and then there the thought experiment is maybe you're an accountant and you become a coder at Microsoft or Google. You're switching from, in this case, being in a licensed occupation, having attained a license, but you're no longer in a licensed occupation. You don't need the license in order to do your work, but you still gain somewhat. And the wage growth for people who switch in, that is people who are in a non-licensed occupation and then switch into a licensed occupation, their wage growth is about $1,800, less than those individuals who are stayers. And the wage growth for new hires also tends to be positive. That is, we can measure individuals who are moving from being not in the workforce and moving into a licensed occupation. Their wages also tend to be statistically significantly higher for those individuals. We can't get wage changes because they were not in the workforce in the previous period. So in general, you find that people who are in licensed occupations stay there, tend to gain. So what are some different robustness checks? So we look at different licensing indicators, and I guess I have some time. I can go through some of these. So we look at a number of different robustness checks. That is people switching in from a different occupation. So these are sort of the heterogeneity. People who are not licensed, and these are people who are switching in. Occupation differences, that is switching out of and to a different occupation. So these are individuals in the first column who are not licensed, people who are licensed, and you can see that in general, people who are non-licensed going from J to J moving out tend to be higher, except for pest control workers. Those folks tend not to like their job very much and tend to switch out. I guess not surprisingly. In general, though, the licensed occupations tend to move out. Also switching in from non-employment. So in general, there's not as much switching in. So these are the people, the bar, the colored bar tends to be individuals who are in non-licensed occupations. These are the average, and people who are switching from non-employment, again, that's individuals who are unemployed or not in the workforce, tend to have lower switching into licensed occupations relative to unlicensed. Switching to non-employment, we find basically the same results. These again are robustness checks. I won't go, we basically find very similar results for people who are switching from jobs to, who are in a licensed job. The only occupation that is higher than non-licensed are cosmetologists, who tend to and that tends to be a highly volatile with a lot of variance, but they tend to switch out of that particular occupation. Some more definitions, switching in using the licensing indicator of universally licensed occupations, using some questions 1 and 2 versus questions 1 through 3 in the CPS. We find basically the same general magnitude. Individuals who are not licensed tend to switch in and out of occupations. People who are licensed tend to switch in and out a lot less. And also when we look at various regression switching numbers, we find basically the same basic results in terms of our general robustness checks. So those are sort of our overall results. We also test for the parameter stability and selection on unobservables. This is a test by Altanji et al. And others that are trying to examine whether unobservables that are not, for example, in the CPS, are they large enough to overturn our results? So if you included the unobservables, would they be so large as to turn our results from a negative effect of licensing on switching or positive effect of licensing on earnings? Would they be large enough to flip those results? So we use some basic, and this is for the good of the cause, the OSTER results for being able to check for omitted variable bias is available in Stata, so you can kind of do that. It used to be a lot of work. I've done a lot of the testing for omitted variable bias by hand. It used to be a very time-consuming and lots of coding that used to that we had to do. Now it's fairly easy to do since Stata has a very easy test using how large the unobservables would have to be in order to flip our results. So that when we look at, for example, our switching in rates with no covariates, as we add covariates, this is what happens. And these are the bounds for how large our results would have to be. So they would have to be, and depending on the level of the R squared, they'd have to be 1 and 1.5, between 1 and 1.5 times larger than than the results we show in order to flip our results. So you'd have to come up with some very large omitted variables in order to flip our results for the switching in rates. We also do the same thing in terms of our bounded results, in terms of looking at the effects of licensing and our switching in rates, using some alternative measures, looking at various results. How large would the R squared have to be, again, to switch to change our basic results, using our matching procedure. Again, the results would have to be, the value for delta would have to be pretty large. in order to switch, and these are the bounds of our estimates in order to switch our results from the negative and significant results that we find. There's switching out rates. We also tested for potential impact of unobservables on our results. Again, you can sort of see this. These are as you add covariates, what is the effect on reducing the switching out rate? And again, using the Altanji et al. Method for testing how large unobservables might be in terms of their ability to switch our results. They would have to be fairly large. Again, so we have fair amount of confidence in our results based on at least these basic results. We look at wage gains, again, in terms of unobservables on individuals who were in the occupation. Again, we try to control for potential unobservables for our wage changes for individuals who stayed in the occupation. Again, the results would have to be fairly large in order to flip our results. Again, switching in, we do, some robustness tests for the ability of unobservables to flip our results. And again, the results tend to be fairly robust to potential unobserved variables changing our basic results. Again, switching out, and those results tend to be, again, fairly robust. One other measure or one other result that we tried to look at is looking at our results are generally OLS. We used as our instrument the percent of the people in the occupation who are licensed as an instrument relative to whether the individual was licensed, and used, these are OLS versus two-stage least squares results when we instrumented whether the individual was licensed and relative to whether how many people in the occupation were licensed as our IV, and it generally was a fairly robust IV in terms of meeting first stage F value characteristics, and those the two-stage results tended to be fairly consistent with our OLS results, using, again, another test for how robust our empirical estimates were. So this is sort of our paper. Sort of the key takeaways from our results is in terms of rather than looking at equity effects of licensing, we look at the efficiency effects, cost benefits, welfare effects of occupational licensing. That is, the inability to move across occupations might be added to the cost side of whether welfare, what are the overall welfare effects of licensing, and some estimates that I and others may have done, so that what we find is licensing decreases the frequency that workers switch occupations. Over the past 2 decades, licensing accounts for about almost 8% of the total decline in the occupational licensing switching rate. Given that it's declined overall, part of it can be attributed to occupational licensing, and the link between licensing and labor market fluidity represents an additional channel for welfare effects of licensing relative to the literature, which estimates a cost that is a welfare cost of about 12% of a decline within licensed occupations, at least the overall welfare costs of occupational licensing in terms of employment loss relative to what people are willing to pay for licensed workers. This might be an additional factor that could be added to at what cost do you want an occupation to be licensed. Licensing acts as a barrier for workers who would switch into a licensed occupation. They're about 10% less likely, looking at the controls that we used. The effect is stronger for employed workers than non-employed workers. We think that, as I mentioned earlier, it's due to the opportunity cost effect. Individuals who are not employed can bear the costs and arguably can spend the time for specific training to enter a licensed occupation. Although the costs are negative, it's not as big as for those individuals who are employed. And licensed workers also experience higher wage growth, whether they stay, whether they switch out of a particular occupation. So getting a license helps you whether you are in the occupation or whether you switch out of the occupation. For licensed workers who stay in their occupations, they experience about a little over 6 percentage point higher wages, or about $2,200 on average per year than their non-licensed workers. So overall, these are sort of our first estimates, rather than a lot of the other labor market dynamics, looking at people who move across states, which has been looked at, looking at individuals in terms of overall wage gains in the survey of income and program participation. We look at that. We look at this issue in terms of whether individuals are likely to switch occupations. Any questions?
And we have about 8 minutes for questions.
Yeah, I have a question. I guess I'm just wondering if you could comment at all on what you would think of as the first kind of low-hanging fruit that policymakers could, if think of this as the specific goal of increasing labor market fluidity. What do you have any idea of what they might first try? A first way to change a first regulation to tackle, or a first aspect of occupational licensing, or is it a particular occupation or something to increase fluidity here?
Well, very good question. I think that in general, a lot of the intensive margin effects, you've seen sort of the ratcheting up of licensing requirements. And the example I provided earlier was for physical therapists, where you've had this, arguably that's the most dramatic effect. It's also happened in accounting, which a number of people at the conference have looked at. But for physical therapists, you have this very dramatic, intensive change, which really serves as a very large barrier to entry. So that's sort of, are these requirements needed? And it really needs to be looked at on an occupation by occupation specific area. Do you really need to have 5 years to become a CPA relative to 4? Do you need to be a doctor of physical therapy relative to having a bachelor's degree in some specific training in order to enter those occupations? So there's been a lot of the ratcheting up of the effect of licensing. So that's sort of the big, the elephant in the room is the specific and education requirements relative to the what might be easier to deal with, although there are issues with respect to incentive compatibility. States view fees and renewal costs as a very important source of revenue. Some go to the boards themselves. In other cases, governors can use the excess to balance budgets. So you've seen this very dramatic increase in fees and renewal fees that have occurred, which I showed earlier, which that might be another way to reduce, especially for lower income occupations. You're spending, the growth rates have been well over 100% over a decade. So those are sort of, again, it needs to be occupation by occupation specific, and that the ratchet effects tend to be the big issues that are the largest barriers to entry.
Now we do have 2 questions in the queue. Steve Slavinsky from Arizona asks you, how might state reciprocity reform influence this? In other words, might the choice of an occupation be based on how likely it is to allow migration?
Yeah, very good question. Certainly, and again, I like to look at the data as opposed to narrative economics. Some people like look at the narrative, but one thing you could do is look at, given that these are state by state requirements, if you were going to be an engineer, you might want to look at passing or seeing how you could enter an occupation which has fewer barriers, since these are state by state requirements. And the example is you could enter the occupation in Arizona, and if there is reciprocity, move to California. So that might be one way to enter the occupation at a lower cost, and you can game the system. We basically looked at initial entry and the ability to move across occupations, but licensing in and of itself is a barrier to moving across occupations, both for the cost side, that is the initial cost of entry, you got to pay fees, and you have to meet the state by state requirements, even if you're moving across state lines. And if you're trying to enter a new occupation, those barriers are even higher.
Okay. The next question in the chat comes from Bobby Chung at UIUC. He says, hi, Morris. Based on your model, what would be the prediction on service quality? It seems to be increasing.
It wouldn't. Service quality you would expect if wages go up. That's one measure of quality within our model, and certainly within the welfare effects that wages could go up for individuals who are licensed. Their wages go up, but and that's true in any welfare analysis. Wages go up for individuals who are in licensed occupations. However, when you take into account some of the work that he's done, and I've done with Evan Soltis, the effect on reducing employment is much higher than wages going up. So the overall welfare effects are negative because employment goes down a lot more relative to wages, which is one measure of prices going up.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions if anybody has one.
I have a question for Morris. So in terms of the interpretation of labor market fluidity, so one interpretation, I think, a reduction in labor market fluidity reflects some sort of barriers that prohibit people from freely choosing their favorite jobs, locations. Another interpretation could be people just find a very good match, so they don't just want to move. So can you comment a bit on that?
Yeah, certainly. Very good question. And the issue is, and this is true in a lot of occupational choice models, is that people choose their occupation. But the idea is if there's any exogenous shock, or you go into an occupation, you don't find it to be a good one, and you want to switch, then your ability to switch into a licensed occupation is reduced. So to the extent that there's selection, our results, if there are selection effects, then our results may be picking up the fact that people who choose licensed occupations find better matches. But when you look at least our ability to control for selection in terms of using exact matches and looking at these over time, we are able to suggest that this is a barrier to entry beyond what you would expect in terms of self-selection.
I see, thank you.
Okay, and with that, we've gone through our morning sessions. We're going to take a quick break so everybody can stretch their legs, use the restroom, get a snack.
Well, thank you for your comments.
Oh, Sorry about that.
No.
Thank you, Morris, for presenting. This was great. Morris actually presents again tomorrow morning, so we get to hear about more exciting research he has. On that, we'll reconvene at 11:55. It's going to be on the same line, so feel free to stay in the chat and just mute yourself or come back as you want. See you soon.